On Plugged In, rising tensions between the United States and Iran after the U.S. announces crippling new sanctions and sends a naval carrier strike group into a potential collision course with Tehran.
It's going to be a bad problem for Iran if something happens, I can tell you that. They're not going to be happy.
U.S. intelligence suggests Iran was planning attacks against U.S. interests, something Tehran dismisses as fake intelligence. What does the latest impasse mean for the Iran nuclear deal and for the country's nuclear ambitions? We will hear from experts on both sides and tell you what this developing conflict might mean for a region that controls nearly 1/5 of the world's oil. Welcome to Plugged In. I'm Greta Van Susteren. The world's eyes are on Iran and the Arabian Sea. That's where the United States is bolstering its military presence, deploying an aircraft carrier and strategic bombers to defend U.S. targets against alleged Iranian threats. VOA Pentagon correspondent Carla Babb has more on the American military response.
A show of force and a clear signal to Iran. A Patriot missile battery and the USS Arlington will join 4 B-52 bombers and the massive USS Abraham Lincoln aircraft carrier strike group. Commanders requested all of this extra power after intelligence picked up potential Iranian threats on land and sea against American forces in the region.
It's important that Iran understand that an attack on Americans or its interests will be met with an appropriate response.
The threats included commercial vessels that Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps had loaded with military hardware to include missiles, according to a senior military official. But a senior counter-Islamic State coalition officer told a different tale.
Have you seen any threat indications?
No, there's been no increased threat from Iranian-backed forces in Iraq and Syria.
After the briefing, the U.S. military said recent comments from the coalition's deputy commander run counter to the identified credible threats available to intelligence from U.S. and allies regarding Iranian-backed forces in the region. All service members assigned in Iraq and Syria are now on high alert.
If we can find some very limited way to respond, I think we will, and I think we should. But if we overdo it, we could be on the path to war.
Officials say the United States does not want war, but it will protect American forces.
For more on U.S. military strategy in the region, we are joined by VOA Pentagon correspondent Carla Babb. Carla, nice to see you, and you can tell from that package that we just aired is that you are in these briefings. Do you have a sense from walking the halls of the Pentagon, talking to people, are they preparing for a war?
Well, not at this point. This is a planning building, and so they've got that in their bag, so to speak. You know, we've heard from the New York Times with the reports that there are preparations for up to 120,000 troops or more, if you believe President Trump, going there. But this isn't at that point yet. Right now, they're focusing on what they say is intelligence that showed that Iranian-backed forces, I've heard IRGC, that's the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, has been trying to plan attacks on U.S. forces.
But no more details as to where those attacks will be.
Not at this point, and that's why the Pentagon Press Corps is a little skeptical. That's why you saw me asking the questions about the increased threats, and that's why we keep pushing for proof. Show us those declassify those documents, show us what you're looking at so we know you're telling us the truth.
Are you getting the same answers from everyone you're asking?
Many people in the hallway. It's very hard because a lot of this is dealing with classified information that they just can't tell us. But I have been hearing from everyone that they are trying to get us information to show us more of the threat that they say they're seeing.
All right. And is there a way to compare the military assets that we have in the region, the ones that we're moving to the region, and the military assets of Iran?
Well, the United States is pretty well situated in the Middle East. If you look at where the United States has bases and has its soldiers, sailors, and airmen based across the Middle East, Iran looks pretty surrounded. I mean, you've got everywhere from Egypt and Syria and Iraq on one side, you've got Afghanistan on the other side, and Turkey's not usually considered the Middle East when it comes to the Pentagon, but sometimes it comes in and they've got a base there as well. So all the areas are covered on land, and then outside of that, you've also got the sea threat. We've got the USS Abraham Lincoln, that's 6,000 sailors that are coming in, and that's just the carrier. That's not the strike group, which also includes 4 destroyers. It also includes a cruiser. So we're talking about thousands upon thousands of troops in the Middle East at any given time, probably around 60,000 to 80,000.
Over the weekend, there was an attack on 2 Saudi tankers and two other ships. Has it been determined, what kind of attack it was, number one, and who was responsible, and what was the impact?
I just was talking to officials about that this morning, and they still don't have anything they want to give us on that investigation, but U.S. military officers are providing aid to UAE in this investigation.
Is there any doubt that it was a hostile act? I mean, what are the odds that 4 ships, 2 tankers, Saudi tankers got hit? I mean, what are the odds?
I mean,
coincidentally.
UAE certainly seems to think so, and it was quite interesting that Iran was talking about explosions that weren't happening as the sabotage was happening. So people say, that's kind of hard to look at a coincidence, but there's no proof at this point one way or the other, and so I'm just going to wait until we get the investigation completed.
All right. Well, President Rouhani of Iran says he doesn't want a war. Secretary of State Pompeo says he doesn't want a war. Presumably President Trump says the same. I haven't heard a specific soundbite, but I suspect that he says the same. Yet there's an awful lot of saber rattling, a lot of moving of military assets.
Well, no one wants a war, but the United States wants to be prepared if they're asked to provide options to the president. And when you look at Iran, Iran is pretty well situated. The biggest threat to U.S. forces would be their ballistic missiles. They have a lot of ballistic missiles, about 2,000 of those rocket propellers. They can do a lot of damage there. But a lot of people will tell you that their biggest threat is their use of proxy forces. They have proxy forces situated all over the Middle East.
Militias.
Yes, militia groups. They have them in Iraq. They have them in Syria, Gaza, Lebanon, Yemen. So they can do a lot of damage. Even though Iran is a small country, they use their power in a very effective way.
Which is sort of interesting, because one of the things that the President Trump is asking for in the deal that he wants is he wants to have the ballistic missile program shut down in Iran. He doesn't want any of that, and also he wants Iran to stop doing the terrorism around the region, which includes these militias.
Yes, absolutely. And that's the number one thing that everybody in the Trump administration points to. They say Iran is the number one supporter of terrorism across the globe. And until they stop that, why should the United States give them anything to help support them and help them grow?
Big picture, though, Iran is no match militarily for the United States, but could do damage to some of our people.
No match, but it would take a lot of effort and a lot of people if we got in a war. So no one, I believe, wants to do that.
Yeah, and indeed, the leaders have said, both countries, they don't want a war. But of course, there's a lot of saber rattling right now, or something's being,
Absolutely, and both sides need to be careful. And let's not forget that Europe is cautioning both sides to remain calm.
All right, thank you. Carla Babb, our Pentagon correspondent. At the heart of the increasing tension that has brought us to this point is the multinational agreement signed by then President Barack Obama. The agreement was designed to limit Iran's ability to develop nuclear weapons. The Iran nuclear deal, also called the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA, was signed in 2015 after years of global worries that Iran was moving quickly towards the capability to build a nuclear weapon. Under the agreement between Iran and the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, plus Germany, Iran agreed to drastically curtail most of its nuclear activities, including reducing uranium stockpiles and enrichment, limit research and development, and allow international inspectors to verify compliance. In exchange, many financial sanctions that had crippled Iran's economy were lifted. As a candidate for U.S. president, Donald Trump called it a bad deal, vowing to pull out if elected. In May 2018, President Trump kept his campaign promise, withdrawing from the agreement and reinstated economic sanctions against Iran. The deal's remaining signatories are now being squeezed. Washington is pressuring them to also withdraw by imposing economic sanctions on countries that buy Iranian oil. And Iran is threatening to ignore limitations on how much nuclear material it can keep. Pompeo abruptly canceled his planned visit to Moscow for emergency talks with European leaders in an effort to push for a united front against Iran. But rather than changing hearts and minds, Pompeo may have inadvertently hardened the positions of European diplomats who are trying to save the Iran nuclear deal. British Foreign Secretary Jeremy Hunt said he fears escalating tensions between the U.S. and Iran could spark a conflict. VOA Persian Service senior correspondent Geeta Aryan spoke with Brian Hook, who's policy advisor to the Secretary of State and special representative for Iran. She asked about U.S. intentions in the region and the intelligence reports that prompted the U.S. military to prepare for a possible strike.
What we've said is we need to see a change in behavior. And you can then define that however you'd like in the context of negotiations. But we have said all along that words are not going to be enough. That what we need to see is a change in this regime's revolutionary behavior. For 40 years, they have been exporting their own sort of version of revolution and clerical rule throughout the Middle East, trying to stir up Shia populations against the established government in the country. So we certainly think the Iranian people would like to see more time and money spent on the Iranian people and less time and money spent building this Shia corridor of control that runs from Lebanon to Yemen.
Right. Of the 12 demands that the U.S. has of Iran to change its behavior, what would be good for them to start off with? And does the U.S. require Iran to act upon all 12 at one time before getting into negotiations?
The 12 requirements are really focused around what we're looking for in a new deal. So the current deal is limited to the nuclear program. We know that Iran's threats are not limited to the nuclear program. They have missile proliferation. They're trying to, they're testing for an intercontinental ballistic missile with these space launches that they keep doing, the funding of their proxies, the deployment of Quds Force soldiers around the Middle East. Any new agreement with this regime is not going to be limited to the nuclear piece. It's going to be broader than that. It is going to include the nuclear program, the missile program, and the regional aggression, and the arbitrary detention of American citizens. That is the right approach to this regime. The last administration focused just on the nuclear program. Whatever modest and temporary benefits that have been achieved in that category have come at the expense of every other category.
Right, but to get talks started, do they have to take only maybe one or two steps to show a goodwill?
I think Iran knows what it needs to do. I don't think there's any mystery. We have been completely clear all along for 2 years about what Iran needs to do differently if they want to reestablish diplomatic relations with the United States and to have our sanctions lifted, which we have talked about doing. Right. And so we are ready to do these. I did a video in front of the Iranian embassy on Massachusetts Avenue saying that we look forward to returning the keys to this embassy to the Iranian people. And that day can come. The Iranian regime, that day is not going to come for as long as the Iranian regime is running its expansionist foreign policy.
Apparently, Iranian stock market has fluctuated quite a bit. How do you see the Iranian economy in the near future, given the sanctions that are being applied by the U.S.?
Iran is in a recession now, and that is going to get worse because that is the price that this regime is going to pay for behaving like an outlaw regime. It can't be without consequence. You can't run this violent and very expansionist foreign policy for 10 years and not expect any consequence. We are now putting in place unprecedented historical pressure on this regime so that there's a contest. And I think from 2007 all the way up until about 2016, the Quds Force and the Revolutionary Guards were largely given a free hand to operate in the Middle East, going into these countries, dissolving national identities, and then inspiring sectarian violence against the legitimate governments in these countries. So we have really put our foot down and we've said no more, and we're serious about it. This stuff has got to stop. Secretary Pompeo has said that the biggest threat to peace and security in the Middle East is Iran. That's post-ISIS, we can say that. It's Iran, and we're very we're very determined to implement this foreign policy for peace and security.
VOA's Gita Aryan joins me here in studio. Nice to see you.
Thank you, Greta.
In speaking with Brian Hook, he said that Iran is in a recession. What does that actually mean on a day-to-day basis right now for the people of Iran? What are they experiencing?
High inflation, very high inflation due to the devaluation of the national currency. With every sanctions announcement by the United States, the Iranian rial lost value, and with that comes high inflation, starting with the most basic goods. Since the United States pulled out of the deal, the rial has been losing value, and prices have been going up. Therefore, gradually, the middle class has been affected, and right now, I understand that they're saying that 40% of the population is below poverty line. I think that speaks a lot.
If 40% are in that situation, and it's been since President Trump pulled out a year ago from the agreement and the sanctions are reimposed, in general, and I realize it's not everybody, are the Iranian people blaming the hardline leaders of their country, or are they blaming the United States for reimposing sanctions?
The people in general are blaming the regime, the establishment, and they're saying that it's mismanagement, embezzlement, fraud, and which during the past year, finally, the government has started to deal with it and trying to identify people, but that doesn't solve the people's problems. What's done is done. And the U.S. sanctions, actually, when President Trump decided to pull out, people actually welcomed it, because they are fed up with the entire system. It's not just the sanctions, it's also domestic repression that is actually bothering the people. You've heard a lot about political prisoners and other human rights violations. So the economic aspect of this whole tension right now, the people are not blaming the United States. Actually, they see it as, they welcome it maybe as a pressure point for the Iranian regime to change course, to allow the country to flourish and for people to be able to, at least get by, because a regular employee right now is very much under pressure just to make ends meet.
When President Obama struck the deal and signed the deal with then Secretary of State Kerry, one of the things was the unfreezing of Iranian assets here in the United States, and also there was a significant amount of money that was transferred to Iran, and we've seen video of that. There have been reports that money was then used to fight other battles in militia and Syria and everything, and that didn't go so much to the Iranian people, and that they are upset because they felt that they didn't get the advantage of it. Is that an incorrect report, or is that a pretty fair report?
That seems to be a fair report, because nothing has changed in the economic situation of the people. Actually, it has gotten worse. So the money was not spent domestically. The Iranian government, or establishment, we should say, has never, ever been accountable to the people. People were never aware that their money was being spent overseas for other activities. Had it not been for the United States making these revelations, the Iranian people would not have known.
The Iranian people have been unhappy many times over the years with taking to the streets. In 2012, in June of 2012, they protested. And the whole world watched, and we thought that there might be perhaps a regime change. That didn't happen. So, I mean, what's different about now, if anything?
Well, discontent is much, much higher. They're under much more pressure. And however, one thing is that right now they don't have a central figure. Right now, the discontent is sporadic. We do see protests here and there across the country, but they're not united. For a while, some groups were supporting the others, coming out in support of the others, demonstrating, but the regime has the guns. And they're brutal. They do not, they're not afraid of arresting people. Jails are being filled every day. So right now it is basically the fact that the regime is standing in front of it and threatening people. The thing is that when people are arrested, families don't know, they don't hear about their loved ones, that they disappear basically in one way or another unless somebody somehow gets the word out to the world that, you know, people have been arrested. So it's the establishment is standing in front of the people, and it's just a unity.
There's a difference. There's
exactly.
All right. Gita, thank you very much. Gita Aryan, senior correspondent with VOA's Persian service. A key player as the Iran deal unravels is the European Union. The EU has been trying to salvage the agreement amid intense pressure by Washington to scrap it. European diplomats are hoping to avoid further escalation, warning that pushing Iran into a corner could have dangerous consequences. VOA's Henry Ridgwell has more from London.
Fighter jets launching from the U.S. aircraft carrier, the USS Abraham Lincoln, in the Mediterranean earlier this month, en route to the Middle East. Alongside the naval strike group, several B-52 bombers have arrived at the U.S. airbase in Qatar, designed to counter what the Trump administration says are clear indications of threats from Iran to U.S. forces.
The question comes, how is Iran going to push back? How are they going to show the United States that if you keep pressing us, we can respond? And at that point, if they get that wrong, there is a risk of runaway escalation.
Europe believes that risk is dangerously high, a point made clear to US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo as he arrived in Brussels for talks.
We are living in a crucial, delicate moment where the most relevant attitude to take, the most responsible attitude to take is, and we believe should be, that of maximum restraint and avoiding any escalation on a military side.
Washington pulled out of the 2015 nuclear agreement with Iran last year. Up to now, Europe has urged Tehran to stick with the deal and effectively wait out the Trump administration, says analyst Watling.
What we've seen is the US administration putting an awful lot of pressure on the viability of that policy. And in pushing the Iranians to the point where they have walked away from a key component of the deal, it essentially underscores the fact that that might not be possible to continue in that direction. So Europe will have to decide.
Meanwhile, the US continues to tighten the economic noose. India was a major importer of Iranian oil, but stopped purchases this month in the wake of renewed US sanctions. Visiting Delhi, Iran's foreign minister issued this warning.
But unfortunately, the United States has been escalating the situation unnecessarily. We do not seek escalation, but we have always defended ourselves.
Watling says any conflict with Iran would quickly engulf the region.
It has to fight essentially a regional deep battle, which means activating a lot of the assets they've developed potentially in Lebanon, in Iraq, and conducting ballistic missile strikes.
Fear of such a conflict has rattled Europe, caught between the demands of its US ally to abandon the nuclear deal and warnings from Tehran that such a move would lead to a resumption of its nuclear program. Henry Ridgwell for VOA News, London.
Amid the increased tensions in the region, the U.S. State Department is ordering all non-essential American personnel out of neighboring Iraq, which is home to Iranian proxy militias. So what is the end game here? Is the U.S. trying to stop Iran from building nuclear weapons, or is the Trump administration intent on regime change? To help us out with the big picture, we're joined by Suzanne Maloney. She's Deputy Director of the Foreign Policy Program at the Brookings Institution, and she's also the author and former Middle East advisor for ExxonMobil. Welcome.
Thanks so much.
Just to sort of start us, since many of our viewers may not understand this original deal with Iran and the other nations, this was not a treaty, but this was President Obama signing this. That's right?
Well, in fact, it was an executive agreement. It was not signed by any of the parties, but it was the product of more than a decade of negotiations between Iran and the international community. And it was an agreement that has been supported, endorsed by the United Nations Security Council through a resolution, and involved all of the major powers of the UN Security Council.
The only reason I make that distinction is because people may wonder how a new president can come in and just, get rid of an agreement. You couldn't do that if it had been a treaty, was my point in the beginning.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, right. Has Iran cheated or breached this agreement in any way? The IAEA, have they said that Iran has complied with it?
The International Atomic Energy Agency and the U.S. intelligence community and those of our allies have all confirmed, in fact, that the Iranians have continued to uphold their obligations under the agreement both before President Trump walked away and since that time.
All right. Is there sort of a big picture situation here in the sense that, when the United States makes a deal, a president signs an agreement, is there any sort of wide-range impact on any sort of agreements that any president, this one or future one, might sign on behalf of the United States with other countries?
Well, I think the rapidity with which the Trump administration both exited the deal and then reimposed not simply a few sanctions, but the full suite of American coercive economic power against Iran has left a huge credibility gap for both our negotiations, any negotiations in the future with Iran, but also other urgent crises such as North Korea. Who can trust that this administration will negotiate in good faith, that it will stay true to any agreements that it makes, and that those agreements can, in fact, endure beyond the lifespan of a single president?
All right. With the agreement that the IAEA says has not breached the agreement in terms of its nuclear weapon program, what about the impact of the fact that money was unfrozen, returned to Iran, that at least there are reports that they are using it to cause all sorts of trouble, using proxies around the whole Middle East to cause terrorism? What about that aspect? Is that a breach?
Well, there are a number of points here. First, the Iranian nuclear program was not, in fact, it was a military-intended program. Iran did not have nuclear weapons, and I think that's important to clarify. Second, the United States did not return Iranian money. What the United States did was to waive or suspend sanctions that had prevented Iran from repatriating the revenues that it had earned for oil sales during the period in which the sanctions were imposed. So we weren't giving Iran any sort of reward. We were giving the Iranians access to money that was in their own bank accounts around the world. What the Iranians have done with that revenue, of course, is to do a variety of different things. And some of those are to continue the sorts of policies that have been quite problematic to regional security, to American interests and allies around the region. We have a lot of tools at our disposal to address that support that Iran provides to bad actors and its destabilizing policies around the world. Instead of using those tools, what we've done is to walk away from the sole measure that we had in place to deal with one aspect of a very complex crisis.
All right. Well, it also has a ballistic missile program, which the Trump administration is also seeking to stop. But tell me, what are those other tools to stop those other issues involving terrorism, Iran supporting terrorism and destabilizing the region?
Well, importantly, the sanctions that were waived or suspended as a result of the nuclear deal did not, in fact, include those sanctions, those measures that were blocking Iranian support to and finance to its terrorist proxies around the region. So we had a variety of economic tools that were still in place even after the deal was done. We have, obviously, the most powerful military in the world, and we have considerable troop presence in the Middle East, as well as a very strong network of allies and partners with whom we've worked to try to address Iran's destabilizing policies. So the idea that the only thing that we could do was to walk away from the one agreement that we had in place to address a part of the Iran problem is counterfactual.
Suzanne Maloney, thank you very much for joining us. Suzanne Maloney from the Brookings Institution. Thank you.
Thank you.
That's all the time we have for today. Stay plugged in by liking us on Facebook at Voice of America. And you can also like my Facebook page at facebook.com/Greta. And do follow me on Twitter at Greta. Thanks for being plugged in.